Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Michael Sanders is the Executive Director of What Works for Children's Social Care. He's the former Chief Scientist at the Behavioural Insights Team, or BIT, in the UK, or what was the first official nudge unit in government. He's a reader in public policy at King's College London and an Associate Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Bristol and did his postdoc studies at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. And I don't know, I'm going to say you probably don't know this, but when I was back in my junior PhD years, this would probably have been like 2013, maybe 2014. I actually attended Harvard's BIG, or Behavioral Insights group. I don't know if it was the first gathering, but what I do remember was some pretty heavy hitters there. There was Mike Norton, Max Bazerman, Todd Rogers, Katie Milkman, and yourself. You were there. So I was this... What's that?
That's some heavy hitters and me.
And yeah, you were in that group. And if I remember, you were wearing a bow tie, which stood out to me. And you presented the early work with BIT. And I was coming in as this really head in the clouds, theoretical social psychologist PhD student, and for the first time, I realized I could do applied work that was still relevant and very interesting. So I actually see what I'm doing today and where I'm at today stemming back to that one event at Harvard with the Behavioral Insights Group. So I guess a thank you note to you. You definitely had a hand in shaping where I am today and what I do today. So thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. I hope it's a positive influence. I guess we'll find out in 50 or 60 years when we start on your career. But yeah, it's gratifying to know I've had some kind of impact on the world rather than just talking to a room full of doctoral students.
Definitely. And I'm sure there's other people in that room would say the same thing as well. Great. So if you would mind then, with that sort of context, let's rewind the clock back to 2010-ish. And I believe I read or heard that you said, and feel free to fact check this, but that the sexiest policy area imaginable is or was tax collection. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that certainly tax collection was not that sexy pre the Behavioural Insights team. I apologize to anybody who works in tax collection for longer than the last 9 years. But one of the things that the Behavioural Insights team, and particularly my former colleague Michael Holsworth, who now runs the North American operation of BIT, did was sort of start running BIT's first initial randomized control trials in policy, which were all done in tax collection. And that sort of really made tax collection, put it on the map as an area for behavioral science to be interested in, and as sort of really a focal point for innovation in public policy. And so if you sort of look at all of the countries where BI has really taken hold, the origin story of that is usually in a tax office somewhere where someone reads Holsworth's paper and then decides to do a trial, or where BIT's moved in or come in and does a paper, or does a study in tax collection. So I've been involved in tax trials in the UK, in Australia, in Guatemala, and in sort of a dozen or so other jurisdictions as well. And sort of we see that as being where a lot of BI gets going, and that's partially because typically we have a large number of people there, so experiments are easy to do. Government is really good at counting how much money it brings in. There are some things government is less good at, but it's pretty good at that. And it sort of just gives us a lever to pull and to show results that have a quantifiable benefit for government in a space which isn't all that controversial. So if you look at some of the most exciting work that BIT's doing at the moment, my former colleagues, which are around domestic violence, domestic abuse, the relationship, the behavioural economics team in the Australian government doing interesting work, working with marginalised or excluded communities. All of those things are really very exciting, but they're also very controversial. It's very difficult to sort of go sort of 0 to 60 in 0 seconds. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is the relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, for example, and the state, and so this sort of tax collection became this real hotbed of activity. And I still think today that it is. So whenever I'm reviewing papers, I'm still getting new experiments come through that take a slightly different or a novel approach to how do we get people to actually pay the taxes that they owe. And obviously, without them doing that, then it's pretty difficult for government to do anything. This is like keeping the lights on level of stuff.
Yeah. So you say like it was our foot in the door for behavioral insights. It made sense. It was something that was established, easily quantified, and it's dollars to count, not like the social psychological constructs involving these abstract constructs like emotion or what have you. So was that the case then? It was just sort of a low hanging fruit because we needed to establish proof of concept. We needed to get the buy in from, in this case, from the decision makers in policy.
Yeah, so it's worth noting that I joined BIT in 2012, so I only have sort of second-hand recollection of a lot of this stuff. But if you think about those original tax trials, I don't think they were essential, but I do think they caught the imagination in a particular way. So a lot of the work that BIT does, which is sort of less widely talked about, is generic policy making. So applying behavioral insights, behavioral science, whatever you want to call it, to the actual nuts and bolts of how does government make policy? How does it think about law? And so David Halpern, BIT's chief exec, then the director of BIT, was also very much involved in getting the British government to count well-being. So our National Statistics Office collects statistics not just on economic growth, on unemployment, and all that kind of stuff, but also on well-being. We're one of the first governments in the world to do that, and that's again partly David saying, these psychological constructs, they are important. There's more to life than money. And so there was some of that. And then if you read some of the earlier reports around energy efficiency and climate change and that kind of stuff, it's sort of much more sort of normal policy advice stuff rather than the trials. So there was a lot of that happening at the same time. BIT might have gone down a very different route if that was the thing that caught the imagination. But as I say, in a climate of a pretty substantial cuts to public services and pretty large deficits, an intervention that is cheap and which we've used gold standard evidence to demonstrate reduces the extent to which people don't pay their taxes on time. That really it catches the imagination of a certain kind of civil servant and allows you to say, okay, well, if we could do that there, where else might we be able to use that? And that sort of I think also brings with it that scientific method, right? So there is no real reason why the dead center of the middle of sort of behavioral insights in government as BIT was back then, and the dead center of the middle of the evidence-based policy making, randomized controlled trials for government movement should it be in the same place, right? There's nothing which ex ante you would say these two things belong together, they're naturally going to occur in the same place. But they, because of that sort of that initial work which Michael Holsworth did, as well as other colleagues, that sort of tied BI and experimental government kind of together since then to where we are now.
That's great. And here we are now, about a decade later. And from my perspective, BI, BD, BE, again, whatever you want to call it, and we can get to that point a little later of how we should actually be branding ourselves, hence the name of this podcast. Question I have for you, and just to clarify, was it about 200 million pounds? Was that first successful intervention, that first successful RCT? Was that the amount of dollars recouped from the tax collection?
So it brings forward the generation of about 200 million pounds worth of revenue. So back then that was about $300 million. That's bringing forward. So in a country like the UK, almost everybody will get around to paying their taxes on time. Well, they will eventually get around to paying their taxes, and they may be late. So we're talking about money brought forward. I think the figure for actual new cash is about 20 million, and that does erode over time because of the fact that people do get around to paying it. In a country where
Mhm.
tax compliance rates are much lower, like in Guatemala, we do see that we seem to be generating genuine new dollars, genuine new quetzales into the tax authority there because the base rates are so low.
Right, of course, and I'll come back to that point in a second. Um, if you wouldn't mind just humoring me in sort of this is how my mind works. I love to sort of live my inner world in a series of counterfactuals. So, if we can experiment with the following thought experiment. So let's say scenario A is what actually happened, is what transpired. 2010 happened. It was a success that we see. It was a success, and it led to 8-9 years later. Here we are, and things seem to be sort of taking off, quote unquote, this behavioral revolution. Now let's imagine hypothetical scenario B, where those first few trials and those first few RCTs that were run were a complete and utter flop. Now, if that's the case, we don't see any sort of viable solutions right up front. Perhaps we don't get any buy-in from the important people where we need to get that buy-in. In your mind, how do you see BI taking off or not, had that been the alternative scenario back in 2010?
Sure. So I think you can probably afford for the first couple of trials not to work. I think you can't afford for the first 10 not to work. So let's imagine your counterfactual where the first 10 trials didn't work. So BIT had a 2-year sunset clause when it was initially set up, which said there are too many government units basically that just hang around forever because no one shuts them down. But we're going to change the default there, a very behavioral thing to do, and we're going to say unless the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary, so David Cameron and Jeremy Haywood as it was then, make a decision to keep us because we've met our objectives, then we will automatically stop existing. So in that world, maybe I can see one of two things happening. Either BIT meets its objectives through other means, i.e., we say, well, we've contributed to this law or to this this big policy thing, and that's saved all this money, and that's had these kinds of effects, even if they're not directly attributable to us and they're not scientifically tested. We've cleared the threshold, let us through, and that's a bit more of a fudge. I think BIT continues to exist in that space. I think BIT is a lot smaller if it does that. I think it probably remains in government. It remains a policy unit inside the Cabinet Office in number 10, but it's not we don't get this same kind of international movement. And we don't get, so we had behavioural exchange in London just last month, and we had sort of slightly north of 1,000 people from something like 50 countries around the world coming to talk about behavioural science and how they're using it in their governments, and that's just astonishing. I think we don't have that. The second option is BIT isn't able to sans trials fudge that sunset clause, and it gets shut down. So David Halpern goes back to the Institute for Government, Michael Horsworth goes back to the Institute for Government, I never join the team, or I join the team for 6 months and then get fired. And I'm probably sitting in a university somewhere thinking about what lectures I'm going to be giving, and I hope, and I think that that movement never happens. I do think that the movement is a little bit resilient. So BIT it's the world's first nudge unit, but it's not the world's first attempt to use behavioral science in government. So if you talk to Patrick Dunleavy at the LSE, he'll tell you, oh, we were doing this stuff in the early 90s where we rewrote letters to make them better. And he's not wrong about that. And, Cass Sunstein was in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under the first Obama administration before BIT existed, before David Cameron was even elected. And those were, I'm not getting, abortive is the wrong word. They were ideas, they were things that started and they stopped, right? So my sense is that this kind of idea that we can use behavioral science, psychology, whatever you want to call it, to make government better is one that would keep coming around again, and eventually, maybe not the UK, maybe next time it would be France, maybe next time it would be Germany, maybe next time it would be Australia. They would keep coming up with these ideas, and so someone would try it again, because governments don't tend to share their failures. So the German chancellery wouldn't know that Britain had tried and failed at this. And then eventually it'll take hold somewhere, and it'll have a different flavor because it's coming from that country. But I think eventually it'll succeed. It's like saying if Ford had been hit by, I guess not a bus because he's Ford, but if he'd been hit by a horse and cart and died before he'd invented mass production, would we be living in a world without mass production? It's like, probably not, right? Mass production was going to happen. It's just a case of who got there first inventing it. And maybe it would look different. Maybe sort of, I guess the Tesla versus Edison thing is if Edison hadn't been quite so effective or ruthless, or if he'd been hit by something or killed in an electrical accident, then we'd have more Tesla stuff and less Edison stuff, but we wouldn't be sitting in the dark with candlelight.
Right. So if it wasn't if it wasn't UK, it's another country, it's another initiative. The timing was there. The things were all in the right place for that stuff to happen.
I think that's right.
Maybe it would have looked a little bit different, but I think I agree to your point that we probably would be here having this conversation, maybe in a little bit of a different way, but still we would be here.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's very easy for us to say. So I believe David Halpern is a unique individual, because I think we're all unique individuals. But like somebody with, so he had tenure at Cambridge and worked for Tony Blair in Number 10, and that's not a common thing in the British establishment at all. So, and he has a unique ability to craft creative ideas whilst being academic, whilst being pragmatic, whilst knowing how government works. But somebody else would have come along. It's very tempting for us to say, my place in history is unique, and therefore without me, everything I've done wouldn't have happened. I think that's probably hubristic.
It's a bit arrogant.
Yeah,
it's a bit Trump sounding, I think.
You might very well think so.
Dare go down there.
Comment.
So there is this notion of different disciplines coming together under the umbrella of BE or BI. So this is a perfect example of you and I having conversations, and even the gathering back at the Behavioural Insights group that I started our chat off with at Harvard. You're an economist by training, is that right?
That's right.
And I am a theoretical social psychologist by training, turned practitioner, turned applied. So, we are, in some regards, we come from sister disciplines, and at other times we're seen as sort of strange bedfellows. You guys, the economists, you love things that are easily measurable and quantified. And we social psychologists, we pretend to as well, but often we find ourselves dabbling in these, as I said earlier, these fluffy and these abstract concepts like emotions. And now I'm wondering, coming out of the theoretical side and more into the applied side, is should we even be looking at things like, you said earlier, happiness and well-being, and other emotional or motivational constructs, or should applied behavioral insights and behavioral science and behavioral economics, should that be staying out of the black box and just looking at the sort of the concrete, observable things that are easily measured?
So that's a tricky one. So I think that in order to have a well-rounded account of humanity and of the impact that government policy or whatever is going on is having on humanity, we do need to think about things like how happy are people, what's their well-being, yada yada, all of that stuff. He said, sounding like an economist, where he sort of just comes up with two hard-to-measure constructs and then gives up. So that's absolutely right. We do need to think about those things. In terms of what is practical and pragmatic, government measures the things that government thinks are important, right? So government could have set itself up because a lot of what we know about stuff. So let's think about inflation. So you say economists like things that are easy to measure, which implies to me you've never tried to measure inflation. Um, but like, the way we measure it is we send out people to a bunch of shops to buy a bunch of stuff that reflects what people are buying, and then we see how much its price increases. And people go out and they're doing this constantly. It's an enormous undertaking. But the reason we know what people are buying in the UK and in other countries as well, but in the UK I'm talking about here, is we survey them, right? So we send someone out and we ask people, what did you buy in this 2 week stretch, and then we use that to create a basket of goods that reflects what the average British household is buying. Um, if you wanted to measure national happiness, how much is happiness going up or how much is happiness going down, you would probably take basically the same approach. So it's clear that we've made a choice there. It's not just about being difficult. We've made a choice. The government is prioritizing the numerical, the economic. To the extent that things get counted, they are therefore easier for somebody else to come in and count. So if you think about there's a clock somewhere in the Behavioural Insights team which is counting up to 1,000, which is the point at which bits run 1,000 randomized controlled trials. Which I'm very sad I won't be there for that. But that's a pretty momentous achievement for them to have run that many trials. And the reason they've been able to run that many trials as cheaply as they have done is because they're using the data that already exists. So government is choosing what to collect based on what it thinks is important, and then BIT is kind of parasitically or opportunistically using that data in order to evaluate whether or not particular interventions are having an impact on those things that government cares about. So I think we're all a bit guilty in sort of economics and in field experiment land of looking around for a cool data set and looking around for something which we can manipulate and measure easily without having to employ a million research assistants. So, and that gets us off the hook for thinking really deeply about what actually is the most important thing here. So I think we could do much more and we could do much better. But I also think that there are some things that are okay to sort of cut those corners. So think about economic growth. Like people who are richer are happier than people who are less rich. And so should the government be prioritizing people being richer, like on average? Yes, probably. And in particular, it should be focusing on people who are currently the least rich because there is the greatest marginal gain to be had there in terms of happiness. So we don't measure happiness, but I think it is something that it is in our minds when we're thinking about it, and these proxies work pretty well most of the time.
That's great. And I I realized I probably misspoke when I said you economists, you people measure things that are easy to quantify. I might have just lost my listener base who are economists there. But then to be a little bit harsh on social psychology and psychology generally, it's, I think, part of the reason we're in such a replication crisis, a crisis is what some people call it, is because we're dealing in some of these constructs. And now that I see some of them being applied in behavioral insights, whether it's in policy or in the private sector, I'm concerned and I'm worried, because if we can't replicate some of our most basic effects and theories and findings in a very controlled laboratory setting, what chance do we have to do it in a field experiment or in an RCT where things are much, much more messy? And I don't think anyone's really having conversations when we're trying to apply directly the social, psychological, or the psychological insights that are outside of economics. And I think we need to have that conversation because the stakes are much higher now. It's not just some RAs running these quirky little experiments in a lab. This is quote unquote real life that we're dealing with.
There's, I guess, two parts to that. The one is that the stakes are higher, and that I always argue when I'm teaching sort of people who have actual jobs as opposed to students about this stuff, is we naturally think in government, or if we're working in the private sector in that kind of space, we don't have to be as rigorous as academics do because we're doing like practical applied stuff. The academics are there for the rigor, but like from my perspective, we need to be much more rigorous. We need to hold ourselves to a much higher standard. If I run a MTurk study with 200 people in it or 60 people in it, let's say, and I'm paying them each $1 to do some like hypothetical scenarios, then if I cheat, if I p-hack, if I fabricate my data, even, like, who cares? If we're talking about an intervention in the real world, so take the one of the largest studies I was involved in a bit, which we just published, which is a study with 110,000 job seekers helping people who are unemployed to get back into work in a reasonably deprived county. If I p-hack, if I fudge that, if I make up my findings to make it look like my thing worked, that's tens, hundreds of thousands of people. This is now national policy. So over the course of years, it's millions of people whose lives I'm affecting, whose lives I'm changing, basically on false pretense. So we must hold ourselves to a higher standard in government than we do when we're in academia, I think, because as you say, those stakes are so much higher. The flip side of this, and is there's a replication crisis going on in social psychology, and a lot of that replication crisis is concentrated around interventions, and I'm not going to name any, which are cute, right? They're interesting, they're novel, they're make for a really good BuzzFeed article of like, you'll never guess these 5 tricks to boost your well-being, or whatever the construct is,
or a TED Talk,
or
in some cases,
or a TED Talk. Yes, without naming any particular people or interventions, or a TED Talk.
of course.
Those aren't the ones that people are saying, oh, we should really apply those in government, right? No, but if I go to a senior minister in a government and I say, we're going to do, I can't say an intervention. I'm going to say, I'm going to do one of these interventions to get people back into work, because I saw a BuzzFeed article, I saw a TED Talk, or whatever. The, highly intelligent person on the other side of the desk isn't going to buy it because they're immune to cute. And so the kinds of things that we're testing in the field tend to be things like social norms, tend to be things like reciprocity, which are things that do seem to replicate much better in lab experiments and in field experiments, and that's because there's sort of a, can I convince a cynical civil servant or a cynical minister that this is a good thing to test? And what David Halpern always calls the Daily Mail test. Like, is this going to end up on the front page of a newspaper saying, look at what these like weirdos in government are testing? So I think that kind of interface reduces the extent to which the replication crisis does move into public policy. But it is a really serious risk, right? If people drink the BI Kool-Aid and they think it's really like everything that has published well in a psychology journal will make a good intervention in policy. And so there is a real skill in interpreting an academic literature and then turning that around and saying, okay, how can I put that into practice in real life? And that's, there are lots of things where I think that's a super cool intervention. I bet that would work really well in the real world in a field setting. And then, you spend 5 years waiting for a good field setting to come along where you could actually test it.
Yeah. And there's a concern in the field of BI, generally speaking, that the skill for, there's the two sides of the skill. There's the skill for being able to read the research, understand the literature, understand the theories, parse apart what is good and bad, what is robust, what is not. There's that. And then there's the skill of actually applying those in a real world field setting. And you might have people who are good at both. You might have people who are only good on the one hand. And then there's people who are very much involved in, who are drinking the BI Kool-Aid, who aren't particularly well versed in either. And so now there's this concern that the talent is being diluted. And like you said, because of these real world interventions, because the stakes are higher, we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, which also means we need to have the talent. We need to have the right people in place who understand and who have that training. and I don't know if this is a concern on policy. I see it more of a concern in corporate and in management consulting, where BI is blowing up. But I'm not so sure it's an issue in policy if you've seen it.
So am I worried about a lack of talent among policymakers? Uh, it is a thing I worry about. It's a thing that at BIT, which we thought about quite heavily, and was actually the reason why we invested in a PhD program. So we brought in our first cohort 3 people. So they're all about to graduate: Eliza Cosman, Annabelle Whittles, and Patrick Taylor. We brought them in and said, we're going to fund you to do your PhDs, but you're going to sit with us and you're going to be doing the policy stuff at the same time. So whilst you're sort of immersing yourself in this academic literature and going to conferences and talking about that, we're also going to be having you working constantly in a policy environment where these kinds of real decisions are being made. So that they sort of trying to create these true hybrids. And I think that's paying off. And those 3 people are among the sort of most talented and most spectacular people that BIT has had come through over the 7 or so years that I was there. So there is a move to increase the amount of talent that is coming into the system, but it is a thing which there is a real shortfall on, right? So, BIT is a commercial business now. If the work is there for 500 people probably, but it's only a 200-person organization because of that need to hire really talented people, and there is a finite stock and a finite pool.
Mm-hmm. That's great that they're doing that initiative, because I do believe it's the best of both worlds. I know plenty of extremely talented, superbly smart PhDs, junior faculty even, who would outdo me in research any day of the week, but you put them into a more applied setting, and they wouldn't stand a chance. So I do think it's a unique coupling of skill sets and talent that goes beyond just, are you a good researcher?
Yeah, I think there's
Are
also
you a good
space in
student?
that for specialization, right? So every single person at BIT is not capable of doing every single aspect of that job. Unlike academia, BIT isn't a collective of sole traders; it's a bunch of people working together on things. And so the team that I used to run, the research team at BIT, was focused on some of the academic literature stuff, but our main focus was on econometrics and statistics, because asking someone to have a really high level of statistical knowledge and get the inner workings of government and get how BI works. There are maybe half a dozen people in the world who can do all 3 of those things. And so actually what
Mm-hmm.
you need is people who can do the BI stuff and policy, and then have somebody who they can call on when they need to, who can do the stats. Because that's the other cause of the replication crisis, is just quite a lot of low levels of statistical literacy.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely have not personal experience, but I see that very much being part of the problem. So just to pivot a little bit, you've sort of alluded to this, but you've made a recent change in your career, transitioning to the position of executive director of What Works for Children's Social Care, and that's based out of the UK. Is that correct?
Okay.
And so, just curious, what's your involvement there? What was the sort of the motivation for the change, and what are some exciting things you can share early days?
Sure. So I've been in post for 9 months, so that's it is early days. I won't be able to tell you anything particularly juicy, but let's give it a go anyway. So the organisation is one of 11 what work centres which were established by the British government. They're overseen by the What Works National Advisor, who happens to be David Halpern, who's also chief executive of BIT. So I've moved to a different branch of the same family, in some senses. And what those organisations use to do, what we used to do, is to, for a given policy area, collate, create, and translate evidence. So finding what good evidence is out there, where there are gaps, creating new evidence, so commissioning randomized control trials or other forms of evaluations, and then translating that so that people who are actually doing jobs in the real world can make use of that evidence. So I came in 9 months ago. I was employee 1, so I'm the executive director. I nominally lead the organisation, and that's what we do in children's social care. So anytime somebody comes in touch with the children's social care system, so this is typically vulnerable children and their families, we want to make sure that they get the absolute best from that experience they possibly can do, and that we maximise the well-being and other outcomes for children. So that means we need evidence. So the 35,000 social workers working in child protection social work in this country, they need really high quality evidence. They need to be able to reach into their bag of tools, and they need to know that there's good stuff in there that's going to be reliable, is going to affect real change. So our job is to help create that and to really have their backs in terms of producing that evidence base. In terms of the kinds of stuff we're up to, it's a pretty wide variety of activities. So we're evaluating some huge national programs. So the sort of £100 million or $100 million certainly spending on rolling out some whole system changes to local government. So a county will do social services in a particular way. There are some counties that seem to do it better, and the government is funding them to roll that model out across other counties. We're evaluating whether that works or not. We're evaluating some of the sort of big pieces of practice that exist out there. We're also going sort of further down the system, sort of some more BI stuff around how do we motivate social workers. So we say we have a crisis of teacher retention in the UK. Because 9.9% of teachers left their job last year. So they left teaching. 15.4%, so more than 50% higher, of social workers left their job last year. So if we have a crisis in teacher retention, we have a catastrophe in social worker retention. So what
Wow.
can we learn from behavioral science and from organizational behavior on actually what can we do to make social workers feel more motivated at work, to feel more valued and to be more valued at work, so that they're able to deal with what is an enormously complicated and stressful job under difficult circumstances, and be able to do that and thrive as best as possible. So stuff like that. We're also looking into things like lots of local authorities have spent money on machine learning to try and predict outcomes for children. There are ethical concerns around that, but there are also practical empirical concerns. So like, actually, does this stuff actually work, or is it just people saying they do in order to turn a quick buck? So we've an ethics review of that practice. We're also, we brought in a really excellent data scientist to go around and run these kinds of models in these local authorities, so we can publish it and say, look, here's the standard we're able to get. If you want to charge money for this thing, you've got to be able to do at least as well as this, and you've got to be as transparent as we are. So to really try and shift the dynamic in that market through some judiciously placed evidence. So that's some of the stuff that we're doing. I think we've got 37 research projects on the go 9 months in. So there's a lot going on.
Wow. How big is the team now?
We're, as of like last Monday, we're 20.
That's quite good. In 9 months? Well,
In
just
nine-
less than 9
in
months.
9 months.
And 37 projects.
Yeah, nobody's ever accused me of lacking ambition.
So you guys are busy, which is good. And I was just poking around the site, and I love, there's this, I believe it's a tab. I don't have it open right now. Or maybe I can open it here. Yeah, there's this tab at the top that says evidence store, which I think is just perfect, so that somebody like myself who's just perusing the site can go and quote unquote shop around for the evidence in these different cases and these different interventions in different domains. I think it's excellent. Where did you guys get that idea? Was it borrowed from somewhere else, or is that just sort of your own brainchild?
Oh, we've stolen it wholesale. So the first of the What Works centres, in the same sense as we are, is the Education Endowment Foundation. They were set up in 2011. Basically, I mean, there's a big story behind that which you can read elsewhere. But they try and do what we do, but for educational outcomes, particularly for lower income children. They've run 150 randomized controlled trials in the last 8-9 years, which is just astonishing from a standing start. And they really set the tone and set the bar for what we can do using evidence to try and improve outcomes for people in general, but particularly for young people. So they've got this store of evidence for their 83 trials they've had concluded, where they say, look, these are the ones that seem promising. These are the ones that, they're a good positive effect, and these are the ones where actually just don't go near that. You might think it sounds like it's going to work, but it doesn't. And so we've copied that across. We made a few changes to it, and we've adapted it for our purposes. But that's where we got it from. I wish I could say I came up with the idea. So Kevin Collins, who's the chief executive of the Education Talent Foundation, really is the brains of this entire movement, and the rest of us are just serfs.
Well, it's wonderful. It's a nice layout. It's a nice way to go in and to learn, information that you're perhaps like specifically looking for. And I see I'm just quickly scrolling through, and there are these strength of evidence, I guess 3 circles side by side, and I see that there's 2. I was gonna say there's 2, I guess, that show the strongest strength of evidence, which is family drug and alcohol courts, and the other one I see here is kinship care. And so in this case, just for example, is it that you guys pull in different data, not necessarily within just the UK, but anywhere these trials or these interventions have been run, and you almost conduct like a mini meta-analysis? Is that how it's done?
Yeah, so for both of those, we've conducted a systematic review of all of the evidence that's out there, which, so you start off in these big tables with like 30,000 papers in it. You find the ones that are relevant, and then you find the ones where they're counterfactual. So that could be an RCT, it could be something quasi-experimental, but it's not a before and after. It has to be a certain caliber of evidence. And then you take across the entire piece of that. You can either do a meta-analysis or you can do just a synthesis. Try and say, okay, across all of these studies from everywhere in the world, look at this thing. Does it seem like it has a positive impact on the outcomes that it's intending to have an impact on? And then we draw a conclusion from that. So this is most of the stuff that's on there at the moment is from these kinds of systematic reviews or meta-analyses. What we conclude, as you said, I think there's 16 items in the evidence store as we're speaking now. And only 2 of them have high standards of evidence, and the majority of both of those bits of evidence comes from other countries, so Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. And so what we're trying to do in sort of the majority of our time, the majority of our energies are going into home growing our own evidence, because the child protection system in the UK is very different. I should actually say the child protection system in England is very different to the United States or Canada, and the system in Scotland is completely different again from England because of the way devolution works in this country.
So that's what I was thinking. There's bound to be, as we've seen in many attempted nudging interventions, there's going to be some clear interaction effects and moderation effects by country, by geography of where these things are actually being done. I'm reminded of the classic towel in hotel study that I can't remember the exact numbers, but somewhere of like 20 upwards to 70 or 80% of people were deciding to reuse their towels, and then that the original was in a U.S. sample, and then when they attempted to do it in other countries, in particular Germany, they found it absolutely flopped. They found this null effect. Well, the reason was, which they failed, and they only realized after the fact, they didn't do a premortem. It was because it was a ceiling effect. People in Germany, unlike consumers in the US, were already at 75% people reusing their towels. So it's important to understand the, in this case, cultural differences and the different barriers to behavior when you're going out and applying these interventions and running these RCTs. Do you get a sense that there is that type of awareness out there in the market when people are running, or are they just borrowing wholesale from the nudges that have worked anywhere and everywhere?
So a lot of people are borrowing wholesale. I think one of the good things about this movement, as I say, is that we've tied the doing of the BI to the experimentation. So the first study that BIT ran in international development was a replication of the tax letters trial, as I said, the sexiest area in public policy, in Guatemala. And if we just said, okay, well, it works in the UK, so it'll work here. Let's just do it and move on with our lives. Then we might have, ended up on the wrong side of history there with it not working. But because of the fact that there was this sort of deeply built-in culture of experimentation, we ran a field study there. Stuart Kettle, Simon Ruda, and I, with Marco Hernandez from the World Bank, and we found actually the effects were bigger, if anything, in in Guatemala than they were in the UK. Whereas in some other places, so think, for example, Singapore, where, as you say, everyone pays their taxes on time, studies there basically bounce. So there is a tendency for us to try and apply what works in one setting in another, and that makes sense because otherwise, what are you going to go on? But the fact that we have this experimentation, this experimental culture, does mean that we end up with egg on our face less often than we might do, or rather, we end up unwittingly doing harm less often than we might than other ideas might do.
Good. So just being mindful of our time here and your time, just two final questions. First is, if you weren't, again, in these alternate universe experiences, if you weren't doing what you're doing now, what do you think you'd be doing?
If I wasn't doing exactly what I'm doing now, I think I would be chief scientist at the Behavioural Insights Team. It took me a very long time to leave that.
That's a cheat answer.
That's a cheat answer. I think if I wasn't,
Can't be anything behavioral related.
it can't be anything behavioural related. God, I reckon I would be a hopefully middle-ranking or low-ranking transport economist in the British government.
Okay,
That's my.
so not so. I thought you were going to say like rock star or tattoo artist or something like that.
No, yeah. So our mutual friend and colleague Mike Norton, I think, could accurately give that answer. Anybody who's met me and knows that I wear bow tie is rock star is not really on the cards.
Okay, and my last question, the what I call the BBB, or the big behavioral brainstorm. Now with the big growth and the uptick in behavioral insights in many different industries, what do you see as the sort of global, the world's most pressing problem where behavioral insights can and should be applied?
So my favorite area for this kind of thing at the moment is one which 5 years ago somebody. So this is a story of my failure. So I apologize for the length of it, but I think the narrative is worth it. So 5 years ago, a new member of the Behavioural Insights team came to me and said, "I think we should do work in intimate partner violence." So this is typically men being violent towards their romantic partners. And I said, "We can't do that. It's too important, and these nudges are going to bounce off, right? We don't have the talent, we don't have the expertise for this, and the risk is just so very, very high." And I basically repeated that line for years and years. BITS Australia office, so a few of my colleagues, including Alex Gianni and Karen Tyndall down there, obviously weren't in the same building as me, and so didn't ask whether I thought it was a good idea or not, and went ahead and did a study with men who'd been convicted of this kind of violence and who were being released from prison, so they're being released on parole. And they did it as a really neat intervention to essentially recognize that most of the time, a lot of these people didn't want to reoffend, and to help them to make a plan not to reoffend, and to put a whole series of really well thought through, detailed interventions around them to help divert them from that kind of awful behavior. And the intervention worked. And that was one of the most surprising things that happened while I was at BIT. And it was, I think, my favorite thing that BIT's ever done that I was not involved in. And maybe my favorite thing that BIT's ever done, period. Because it's one of the...
Do you remember what the intervention was that was most effective?
I can, but I'm not entirely convinced that it's public information.
Ah, gotcha.
So I don't want to spoiler anything. But I think that area where if you get... I think this trial is a testament to the fact that if you have a really serious problem where people they do spend the time and they divert a huge amount of energy and talent and frankly not an inconsiderable amount of money to working through it and trying to find a behavioral solution that is, complicated, rigorous and sensitive to the context, and then apply that and test it rigorously, you can have impacts on like really serious things. And like typically violence by men towards women is a huge creator and perpetuator of inequality. So I think that would be the area where I'd love to see like a really serious amount of work and thought going into it by people who are much smarter than I am. which is handy. Like lots of people, almost everybody.
So I lied, and there's one final question. What do we call ourselves? We've sort of bounced around the different terms of BI and BE, and what do you think is the best way to capture all of this work that's being done?
So I don't like behavioral economics for the reason that people like me, economists, tend to colonize other fields. So we arrive in somebody else's field, take all the good bits for ourselves, and say it's political economy. It's like political scientists like that's political science, idiot. So I don't like behavioral economics for that reason. I think I like stealing from other people. So Michael Holsworth, in his PhD thesis, which is a really worth a read, basically defines this as behavioral science is the scientific part. It's the part where we are conducting research to understand human behavior. The application of behavioral science to public policy is behavioral insights, and so that's I think if you're doing it as research, you're a behavioral scientist. If you are doing it in policy and practice, you are a behavioral insights practitioner, and lots of people are both at the same time.
I love that, and to be honest, I hadn't heard that distinction. That's really nice.
As I say, Michael is much cleverer than I am.
Yeah, absolutely, and you said that's his thesis
is where his PhD thesis.
Gotcha. I'll be sure to maybe find that and link it in the show notes. But that's a very useful distinction, and I think that one could have legs for us as we continue to grow, not just in policy, which of course our conversation was limited to that, given your expertise and background, but also in other sectors and in other industries where there's lots of this work being done. So we're over time, but that I could of course chat about this for a very long time, but I believe it's a little bit late in the evening where you are, and so I want to be mindful of your time. But Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been great fun.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.